Hello, good evening. Welcome to The Late Show. Do you know what? If it wasn't for something that was quite spontaneous, you'd have to put up with me again on my own tonight. And I thought, didn't want to do that to you. Not again. Last week was just about bearable, wasn't it? Okay, but we did go through quite a lot of scriptures and things which I thought were quite important, but I only got those literally a few minutes before we went live. But today, before I divulge totally who my guest is today, because if you looked in the hot seat there, you'd see no one, see? But by today's technology and the advances we have, we can Skype somebody anywhere in the world. But we're doing a test, literally at 9 o'clock tonight, just about an hour ago. And at least my producer was, I was trying to get something to eat because I hadn't been up since 5 this morning and I only had breakfast. So it was a long time ago. Do you remember that? Yesterday? Nearly. Anyway, managed to get to Dr. Grady McMurtry, who has been on our screens many, many times. Hello there, Dr. Grady. I know this was supposed to be a test and you're not at home. Where are you?
I'm in northern Mississippi, about 20 miles south of Memphis, Tennessee, in a town called Hernando.
Okay. And what are you doing there?
Ask if Luke can turn the sound up a little bit for me. That would be much helpful.
Okay, well, Luke will do that for you indeed. We don't usually do Skypes from the studio here in London because we haven't had all the technology in place or tweaked to be able to do that. But Dr. Grady, I appreciate the fact that you're not at home where everything works really well and is far more efficient, and the technology you have there is far better than sitting in some hotel room which you have. Whereabouts, what are you doing in that place that you just mentioned, Hernando?
Yes, I'm actually speaking at a church in Senatobia, south of here, Sunday through Wednesday this week. And I'll be at another church in northern Mississippi next week. So that's where you caught me.
That's exactly. Now, we've got new viewers tonight, okay? So just give us a little bit of a 5-minute sort of, or 3-minute pre-say of what is your background and, how did you arrive to become a Christian, which is persona non grata today. I mean, why would you want to be a Christian in the 21st century? I'm glad you see the funny side of that.
Well, I've always been a seeker of truth. That's how I became a Christian. But I started off as an evolutionist. I was a trained evolutionist. I was born in San Francisco. I was raised on the campus of Cal Berkeley, the University of California, Berkeley, which is, of course, the capital of evolution, the capital of liberalism today. And while I didn't graduate from there, that's where I grew up on the campus. And I was taught evolution only as a child, and actually went all the way through high school and through 2 college degrees as an evolutionist. So I earned science degrees as an evolutionist. Then I would go on to teach evolution as well from the 7th grade to the university level. I went on into the corporate world after that. But at the age of 27, in a continuing search for truth, because I thought I had found truth in evolution, but because I was willing to learn, I was also willing to change. And so at the age of 27, I simply asked the question, was Jesus telling the truth or wasn't he? I was actually sick and tired of the whole thing. I had been raised around Christians in a somewhat Christian environment, not a Christian family. But during the 50s, 60s, the United States still had a higher percentage of Christians than today. And so I decided to eventually just tackle the question. Was Jesus telling the truth or wasn't he? Was he the Son of God? Was he God or was he not? And so in a self-guided study that took 6 months, I read the Bible for the first time. I read outside histories of the events of the time. And after 6 months came to the intellectually honest position that Jesus was telling the truth, that he really was who he said he was, that he really had died, really had risen from the dead. And at that point, I made the decision to be a Christian. I was in a room all by myself. And I went to a church, made an appointment with an associate pastor, asked him if there was something else I needed to do. And of course, found out that I did need to make it public. I did need to be baptized, which I did do. But that made me a saved evolutionist, which meant that I had a problem.
I love your sense of humor, Grady. We've spent many days, weeks, months together, traveling in different parts of the world, particularly Israel. So, but you were a bit dry, but you're lovely though. Carry on. Anyway, can I just ask you there, Grady?
Sure.
So you say that you accepted that what was written about Christ in particular, as that he did exist, and that he did die, and he was raised from the dead. You know.
Right.
So what facts were there for you that convinced you of that? Because you must have been a little bit of a diehard evolutionist.
Well, I was not a militant atheist, if you'll excuse the expression. I was not somebody who shook his fist in the face of God and so on. But I would probably have been better described, maybe. I didn't even know the terminology at the time, but perhaps more of an agnostic. To me, if evolution was true, God was somewhat irrelevant. And that's sort of the agnostic position. However, having spent 6 months looking at the histories outside of the Bible, there's at least 9, maybe even 12 valid historians who record that Jesus Christ existed. I mean, he's better established as far as his life than, say, the writers of the, Iliad or something like that. We have far more evidence. But what really turned me to become a Christian was when I read that over 500 people were willing to die, and a rather hideous death, rather than to recant that they had actually seen him after the resurrection. No one will knowingly, voluntarily die to support a lie. There have been people who died to support a lie, but they didn't do it willingly, they didn't do it voluntarily, they did it because they were coerced into it, such as a soldier in a losing cause will still fight to protect his family, but knowing that the cause he's fighting for is not true or not right. And so, to me, that over 500 people were documented to have seen him after the resurrection and would not recant was, for me, enough proof that he was who he said he was.
Mm. But even that on its own, Grady, I know you to be of a mind that you're not easily convinced. You've read the whole of the scriptures for yourself, and I think it took you, 18 months to come to a more intellectually based conversion?
Well, 6 months was enough to then experience conversion, experience salvation. What I did do, though, was, again, it simply made me a saved evolutionist. And so I spent 16 more months looking at the science because, how can you continue to teach an atheistic form of evolution and have a personal relationship with the creator of the universe? It's just, totally contradictory.
Right. Yeah.
And so what I did was for 16 months study the science afresh, anew. The question I asked was, did God use an evolutionary process to create what we see today? Or was what I had learned and taught others wrong, that in fact the Bible was telling the truth when it said the whole thing was spoken into existence, whole, complete, perfect, about 6,000 years ago, and that it was only because of human sin that the entire universe had become imperfect and has become more and more imperfect since then. And so after 16 months of studying scientific law, natural process, physical evidence anew, afresh, I came to the realization that there is no science to support evolution at all. It is a fairy tale for adults. Good science supports a young creation about 6,000 years ago in 6 literal 24-hour days. Good science supports that things started perfect and are in a process of decay. It is evolution, which is not science but religion, that has convinced people, deceived people into believing that it is true when it is scientifically not.
Mm. There's a couple of points, just want to pick you up there, because I can hear ringing in my ears, as it were, people going, well, hang on a sec, how can somebody who would have actually understood that evolution would have taken billions of years, as we've told, to actually get to where we are today, when you suddenly, after some sort of study of the scriptures, you've come to a realization that everything was created in 6,000 years?
Well, first of all, of course, the scriptures and the reliable histories we have outside of the Bible. Now, the Bible is reliable history, but not only the Bible, but histories outside of the Bible make it absolutely positive that he is God, the Son of God, exactly who he said he was, and that the resurrection was real.
Right.
Now, when it comes to the Bible, it clearly states that the earth was spoken into existence, the universe was brought into existence about 6,000 years ago. The genealogies of Matthew and Luke make this quite clear. There's also other references as well. But of course, that's the theological aspects of believing in a young earth, young universe, is simply to believe that God's word is telling the truth. Mm. But to me, of course, as a scientist and a science teacher, I required more. And so, again, over a 16-month period, I came to realize that there was a great deal of science that I had never been allowed to see, never been allowed to think about, never been exposed to, that contradicted evolution. And of course, things like the first and second law of thermodynamics simply prove that evolution is not true, period. End of statement. That is all one would need. However, when it comes to the age of the earth, age of the universe, today we have almost 350, possibly a little more, what are called geochronometers, Earth time clocks, universe time clocks. When you and I first started working together many, many years ago, and we've been working together, good grief, close to 20 years.
My goodness.
We only had about 270. But today we have 350 thereabouts. I have produced 150 shorts with you, the little fillers that we do. Each one containing one, sometimes two, arguments to prove that evolutionary time is not true. We have produced 2 DVDs together on these geochronometers, but there's books, much of this material. But
okay.
Things like the decay of the Earth's magnetic field, for instance, is just one of 350. So there's a lot of science to prove the Earth and the universe are young.
Geochronometers, can you explain that to the layman?
Well, it's very simple. I mean, geo is simply the word used in geology, geography. It means earth, matter, or universe. Chronometer is simply a time measuring device, chronometer. And so a geochronometer is simply an earth time clock or a universe time clock. And geochronometers work this way. They don't tell you how old something is. They tell you that it could be up to this age, but no more. And therefore, geochronometers say, depending upon which one we're looking at, it could be up to 6,000 years old, but no more, or it could be up to 1 million years, or no more. But the thing is, it can be anything less. And so simply because a geochronometer says it cannot be more than 1 million, it is still consistent with 6,000, because it can be anything less. And when you have some 350 of these arguments, many of which prove that the Earth and the universe are less than 10,000, even less than 8,000, consistent with 6,000, and you have the biblical account to put the two together, and you have a rock-solid argument, if you'll excuse the expression.
Very good. So my next question is why, how is it that you seem to come to a realization, as you have described, about these, the third law of thermodynamics and the geochronometers, etc., which point to a young Earth? Why have the rest of the world and those clever guys out there, come up with that it's taken billions of years to get to where we are today?
Well, first of all, I'm not the only one. You know, that would be a total misnomer. There are literally tens of thousands of scientists and science teachers who believe in a young Earth, young universe. And you don't even have to be a Christian, much less a believer such as a Jew who would believe in the Bible. But there are many scientists who recognize things like the geochronometers, even if they're not Christians, and would have to say scientifically that the Earth is young, even though they might know the God of the Bible. And right. So people are totally deceived into the idea that somehow or another I'm the only one, or there's only a handful. It's simply not true. If we went around the world, I said tens of thousands of scientists, but in terms of science teachers, there's probably 100,000 who actually do believe in a young Earth scientifically.
Where did you get that number from, 100,000?
Well, of course, I admit that I don't have the census for it. What I'm talking about is when you take a look at the total number of scientists or the total number of scientific teachers in the world, when you have a population of 7 billion, and you simply start doing tiny percentages, you would come to realize it's those kind of numbers. When you have millions and millions of teachers and scientists, a percentage of them do believe in a young earth, young creation, and they do it scientifically, not just religiously.
So let me ask you, then in context with what you've just said, you do travel quite a lot to Russia. Why is Russia so open to the gospel, or your point of view as you've arrived at in the last, whatever it is, 30 or 40 years?
Well, in a few weeks, at the end of October, I will start my 53rd mission trip to Russia. I've been going 2 to 3 times a year since July of 1994. Now, of course, at that time, the doors in Russia were wide open. I used to go into university classrooms in Russia, teach on the science of creation, give an altar call, and see students, staff, and faculty get saved right in a Russian university classroom. Now, today, That's absolutely illegal, and I would be thrown in prison for doing so. But that's a difference in the administration between Yeltsin and Putin. However, the people over there are still open to the creation science message, and I continue to go as long as I can get a visa. So every year I have to get a new visa to go over there. And I do hope to be back there next February and next November.
Right. Very good. Grady, fascinating, really. And I hope that there are people out there who can write in, email, text, live@revelationtv.com, and the rest of the numbers are on the screen. Don't ask me what they are because I'm dyslexic. But you can put your questions to Dr. Grady right now. So lovely to have you, Dr. Grady. We have been starved of not having you on Revelation TV as much because of the problems we've had technically of not getting the Skype to work. And if you're in a hotel room working on local internet, I think it's amazing how good the picture is and the sound quality. Thank you.
I think it's quite good. Yeah. Although I do remember doing one program with you when I was on Sakhalinsk Island in the Korean Community Center north of Japan.
Really? And that worked
yes.
all right? Well, it probably would, because I think they're a bit more switched on in technology over there than we are in other parts of the West, or any parts of the West compared to there. Right, let me start reading some of the emails and texts that are coming in.
Sure.
Paul writes in, he says, "Hi, Mr. McMurtry. Current thinking is that an asteroid wiped out the dinosaurs. I know it was the flood. And last week there was a program on the ABC where they found the main asteroid that had struck the Earth and wiped out the dinosaurs. They, the scientists, drilled through the cores of the crater and found everything that had melted and was all jumbled up. It dawned on me, could a fountain of the deep have caused this crater rather than an asteroid?" asks Paul.
Well, first of all, in terms of the impact was real. The question becomes, when did the impact occur? What caused it? And did it really, cause the extinction of the dinosaurs? I am going to tell you right now that many of the programs that you're going to find on various channels, I would list some, but I don't want to offend at the moment. The fact of the matter is, many of these programs simply are not up to date. It doesn't matter whether they were filmed a year ago or 10 years ago. They continue to repeat the same information without finding out the new things. The fact of the matter is that major evolutionists today have abandoned this concept. I feel relatively sure that the impact you're talking about is the one on the Yucatan Peninsula. Nobody argues that there was an impact on the Yucatan Peninsula, that it's actually a fairly large impact, but it did not cause the demise of the dinosaurs. The reason that they said this at one time, and I'm going back 15, 20, 30 years ago, was because of what's iridium layer and dust found on the Earth. But recently, dinosaur fossils have been found above that layer, so obviously this is not what caused the demise of the dinosaurs. Now, I would say that absolutely, the vast majority of them died during the flood of Noah. The fossils are because they were buried in wet mud layers from the flood. And the dinosaurs continued to live after the flood because God sent one pair of each unclean kind that lives in the dry land, breathes air through nostrils, to be on the ark with Noah. The Bible mentions dinosaurs or their relatives 9 times after the flood. We have reliable human history of dinosaurs and people living together until at least 1883. And so the story that the dinosaurs became extinct back here from an impact is simply not true. And evolutionists today are abandoning that story in the same way that in droves they are abandoning the concepts of the Big Bang.
Very good. It's the Natural History Museum that I believe it is that where I saw the account, as it were, of the dinosaurs huddled together at a very high altitude, interestingly enough. So they climbed to a height as if they were actually being, if you like, looking to escape water, and which would account for a flood, a worldwide flood, not just a local flood. But they did say in their explanation on the wall that it was down to the fact that this meteorite had hit. But why would they all be huddled in one place? That was quite interesting for me. But of course, the world doesn't want to accept things that are coming from a biblical point of view, and therefore you sort of like are on a no-brainer with them. But do you think that there's more people like yourselves that are starting to think outside the box and not accept the David Attenboroughs of this world's point of view in the BBC, etc.?
Yes, well, I would say that absolutely more and more people are abandoning evolution as a total number of people. Unfortunately, the percentage is the problem.
Right.
But we are converting more and more people through the good science of creation. And again, the evidence for the flood is everywhere obvious. When we take a look at what is really in the ground, the layers of sedimentary rock are there. There are fossils in many of these layers, but the layers are not in the order shown in the textbook. We have polystrate fossils, which penetrate many, many layers, but have no tops or bottoms. Sometimes they're upside down. They could not possibly have grown in these positions. Today, evolutionists agree that the vast amount of sedimentary layers on the Earth were caused by what are called turbidites, meaning underwater mud flows. And so even they are agreeing that this is not slow, gradual accumulation of dust, so to speak, over time, but in fact that all fossils, basically, are simply generated by some form of a flooding action. Now, here's the difference. The creationist, like myself, says that this is one big flood occurring all at one time. Because evolutionist geologists today have to agree that flooding is required for these fossils to exist, they still tell the same story by saying, yes, it was flood activity, but it was many small floods over a long period of time. So the question is not how these layers formed, it's just simply a question of, is it many small floods or is it one big flood? And the evidence is overwhelming that it was one big flood.
Which is what God said would happen, really.
Exactly right.
Yeah. Right, let me go to some of the other messages that are coming in, Dr. Grady, please. Good evening, guys, says Laura. Can you ask Dr. Grady to explain how many people in the Old Testament times were able to live for hundreds of years? Are we to take this as literal years when we read of men and women living from 200 and 300 years old? Now, and I read somewhere that these numbers merely represent the age of their clan or tribe and not their actual age.
Well, again, that's simply another fairy tale for adults. I produced a DVD in conjunction with RTV that's available, and a chapter in my own book on creation about how people could live to be 900 years old. And I list 19 medical and scientific reasons which, taken in combination, would have allowed people to live to be 900 years old under the conditions that existed prior to the flood, under the environmental conditions. Now, the reason that we only live 1/10 as long as people used to is simply because those conditions either no longer exist or they exist to a lesser extent. For instance, we no longer have the hyperbaric chamber in the atmosphere from before the flood. That simply was eliminated completely at the time of the flood. But
explain what a
the
hyperbaric, the thing that you said, what was it?
Hyperbaric atmosphere.
There you go.
Because of the waters above at the time of creation, starting on day 2, there was more moisture in the upper atmosphere than today. That caused the atmosphere above to weigh more, causing there to be more pressure on the surface of the earth. Now, that increases air pressure, what's called hyperbaric. Now, we weren't there. We don't have the instruments that could measure it, but our best estimates are that it was anywhere from as little as 0.6 times more to maybe 1.2 times. And so we're talking about roughly 1.5 to 2 times atmospheric pressure. This is why the large winged reptiles that cannot fly were still able to soar when they could not do it after the flood and became extinct. This is why people used to live longer. This is why reptiles used to live longer. Remember, reptiles continue to grow as long as they are alive. Well, before the flood, they were living hundreds of years. Today in Florida, where I live, alligators live to be 50 years old, but before the flood, they could have lived to be 500. Obviously, therefore, getting bigger and bigger. One of the conundrums that evolutionists have today is quite simple. We continue to find more and more creatures in the fossil record that look identical to living organisms today. Charles Darwin coined the term living fossil. But what's interesting is they're always smaller than they used to be. The evolutionist says things are getting bigger, better, faster, smarter. But when we compare what used to be to what is, things are getting smaller, slower, and dumber. This is an absolute contradiction to evolutionary theory.
Yeah. Very good. There's another sort of question here that I think many viewers would probably be asking the same one, same type of question as Dave. Says, hi, Grady, I think we all agree that the world is 6,000 to 7,000 years old, but how old was God when he made everything? How do we actually know that he didn't make other life forms really basically millions of light years away? After all, it could be that he only lets us know in the Bible what he wants us to know, says Dave.
Well, first of all, he does tell us. He says this is the only place there's anything made in his image. This is the only place where there are people. There's no alien life form, no sentient beings similar to us anyplace else. And you can start in Psalm 115 for that information. Now, that does not preclude God, who can decorate the universe any way he wants to. It doesn't preclude him from making plants and animals on planets someplace else. And we know of thousands of other planets outside of our solar system, none of which could support life. But even if there are planets that we eventually find that could support life, God has ruled out any form of human life or sentient being like us anywhere else in the universe. And indeed, one can use the argument that it says in the Bible, Jesus Christ came here and died once for all. Well, again, if we trust God's word to be reliable, when he uses the word all, he means it.
Very good. Thank you, Marcus, for putting this particular question to Grady, because I think so many of us would like to know. We've said it in times past, Grady, because you have an incredible mind, but we, earthlings here need to be able to help our fellow man with putting the right sort of question, as Marcus says. How would we convince an evolutionist in a few sentences that their theory is misguided?
Well, I think we have to understand that you must know what this individual believes, what they think, where they're coming from, if you excuse the expression. Which means that if a person would be persuaded that the Earth is young through the geochronometers, then that's what we need to talk with them about. If they need to find out about dinosaurs living recently, that we have artifacts, the evidence, reliable histories of people and dinosaurs living together. If that's what they need, then that's what we need to give them. So first of all, you have to qualify the person. It's all fine and good for me to debate an evolutionist and destroy their argument by using something that's out of their field. personally, when I debate evolutionists, I avoid doing that. I always try to beat them in their own field.
Right.
Because somebody will just say, well, you were talking about something they didn't know about. Well, fine, okay, let's destroy them in their own place. So you do have to qualify the person. And we also need to learn how they learn best. Are they visual learners, audio learners, visual learners, readers, etc.? So there's no one pat answer. However, we can destroy evolution through logic, science, history, mathematics, probability. So the question only is, which one is going to speak to that individual person? Now, I mentioned that in good science, we can destroy evolution very quickly. The first and second law of thermodynamics preclude evolution from being true. The very fact that we do have law in science, which is immutable, requires a lawgiver. I think many people forget that. Natural process. No natural process is of any value unless it's whole and complete. And take photosynthesis as an example. I think every school child has been taught about photosynthesis. But if you remove one step, it doesn't work, but responsible for roughly 98-99% of all life on Earth existing. And therefore, life on Earth couldn't exist if photosynthesis didn't come into existence whole and complete at the same time that life began.
Right.
You start seeing that the physical evidence, again, does not match with what evolutionists teach. I mentioned the layers being out of order, for instance. And I have a whole presentation of photographs of mountain ranges from all over the world, every continent, that are upside down. Layers are backwards. There's a classic example in Montana. At Chief Mountain, there's a Precambrian layer of material sitting on top of a Cretaceous layer. According to evolutionists, there's 1.4 billion years missing in between the two layers, and they're upside down according to evolutionary theory.
That's excellent. Yeah. Well, I hope you've, Dave or Kath, that you've actually got a note of that, and you can cut it out. Maybe you can put it on your phone that little bit, and you could say to somebody, have a listen to what Dr. Grady, my friend, said on this, as you try to convince them. Okay, let's move on. Fantastic to see Dr. Grady, and trust he and Nancy are both keeping well. Is Nancy well?
Well, she's doing all right.
Yeah.
We almost lost her 3.5 years ago. She's doing much better than that, but she's nowhere near where she needs to be.
Right.
And we're still praying for her condition and ask for the prayers of everybody else with us.
Send our love and our viewers' love as well to Nancy.
We'll
Bless
do that.
her. Appreciate his superb teaching that's talking about you and ministry so much, and regularly pray for you, says nobody.
We do deeply appreciate that.
Our sincere thanks to Grady for all he does. God bless. This is from Jeff. Any chance he could sell me about 2% of his brain? Mine doesn't seem quite as good as his. Hey, we're all in the same boat there. You get at the back of the queue there, Jeff.
Well, all I can tell you is
IQ.
that my intelligence is simply on loan from God.
Yes. Well, I'm glad he lent it to you for such a time as this. Is there any evidence of pre-flood civilizations, asks Peter.
There is. Not so much civilization, perhaps, but yes, there is, because we find tools, we find toys, we find various artifacts that were made by people prior to the flood. For example, in 1944, a bell, somewhat the size of a dinner bell, made out of metal with an iron clapper, was found in the state of West Virginia in a coal layer supposedly 300 million years old. Obviously, this is pre-flood material that was trapped in the sedimentary deposits of the flood. But we find many other things. We have found over 300 stone tools in California, where I grew up, in layers, according to evolutionists, 55 million years old. We have found a ceramic spoon. We have found a iron pot in Oklahoma. The spoon was in Pennsylvania. We find all these artifacts that were made by people prior to the flood. And we have also found very few, but we have found a few bones of people that lived prior to the flood. Now, do not be deceived by the internet when they say they have found skeletons of giants. That's totally bogus. But we have found various individual bones that are absolutely 100% human in layers that they say are, for instance, 3 to 4 million supposed years old, simply because they date things not by science. There's no scientific technology that will date anything accurately beyond written record. They date things like bones, whether it's dinosaurs or anything else, according to their theory. It's really according to their religion.
But what about carbon dating? I know we've mentioned this many times, but somebody might say that. What about the carbon dating method? You're going to tell me about the 50,000 years or whatever it is?
Well, first of all, even if it worked, and it doesn't, but even if it worked, you could not possibly date anything more than 103,000 years old because our instruments won't measure anything below that level. So if you find carbon-14 in anything, it has to be less than 103,000 years old. What's interesting is, of course, it doesn't work. Again, we have a DVD on that produced in conjunction with RTV, where I show that carbon-14 has 20 scientific fatal flaws. It doesn't work. All of these radiometric dating processes, potassium argon, rubidium strontium, all of them don't work because they all start with 6 fatal false assumptions. But carbon-14 is so much worse. It has 20 scientific fatal false assumptions. The only thing that carbon-14 is good for is proving the Earth is young. Because as I mentioned, we can only go back 103,000 years theoretically, but we find significant carbon-14 in coal, oil, natural gas, and carbonaceous clays from all over the world, proving that the coal cannot be 300 to 360 million years old, as evolutionists claim. If it were that old, it would not contain carbon-14. But that is consistent with the forests of the world being buried in a worldwide flood only 4,500 years ago.
Peter asked a question which is very timely, really, as you've just said what you have. Is there evidence of pre-flood civilizations then? And what are they?
Well, and I mentioned the tools that we have found. So the tools, what you want to think about is, first of all, if human beings had been around even 1 million years, recognizable as human beings, making tools and making artifacts, please tell me, why don't we find them by the tens of thousands? The fact of the matter is, we only find a very few. Now, that proves that humans have not been around that long, just to start with. You know, often the answer is in what's missing, not what I found, but what I didn't find.
For example?
If think with me for just a moment. If evolutionists were telling the truth, and let us say that theoretically some form of primate, an Australopithecine or some other primate, evolved into a human, and that occurred 3 or 4 million supposed years ago, and that humans had been recognizably around for 500,000 to 1 million years. How long is a generation? Well, today you're lucky if a generation is 20 years, but let's just be generous. Let's say that a generation is once every 40 years, and I think that's being quite generous. There's never been a time when people had, that long a generation gap. So 40 years. Now, if people have been around for 1 million years, that would be 25,000 generations. Where's the evidence that they ever existed?
Right. Yeah, it's not there, is it?
It's simply missing.
Yeah. What do they say? Does nobody bring that up, that point, so that they would be put on the spot to produce, hundreds of thousands of millions of artifacts?
Evolutionists never discuss what proves they're wrong. They only show you and discuss what they think proves their position. And of course, they don't have any science for it. So what they do is they take artifacts, what we find, fossil bones, whatever, but they have to make up a fairy tale for adults as to how it got there. I mentioned a bell, a pot, a spoon. Now, these are in layers that, according to evolutionists, no human was existing at that time. And so what's the story they make up? Now, please understand, I'm not using a term on TV that's inappropriate, but they call it OOP art, OOP. which is the abbreviation for out of place. So they call it out of place art, saying it shouldn't be there. And then they make up fairy tales for adults and say, well, actually, it was only a few thousand years ago, but the ground cracked open, the artifacts fell into the crack, the earth closed back up, and that's why we found it where we found it.
That's quite a good explanation.
It's this fairy tale for adult story is to every time you find something that contradicts evolution, they will make up a fairy tale to cover the story.
Okay. All right, here's another one for you. If Adam hadn't sinned, would we have died and gone to heaven? This is from Simon in Windsor. He must be near the Queen.
Indeed. I love that place. Been there many times. The fact of the matter is you're asking a hypothetical question. Now, in general, I don't answer hypothetical questions.
You leave those to me, don't you?
Now,
okay,
see, biblically,
I could answer it. The answer would have been no.
Well, the answer is assuming that we could speculate on such things. Adam and Eve were created by God in physical bodies that were immortal.
There you go.
And therefore, if sin had not occurred, in theory, they would still be alive today.
Exactly.
Because they would live immortal in a physical body. However, that was in a situation of a perfect creation. But because of human sin, the universe became imperfect. Once it becomes imperfect, everything starts a process of decay. So what happens? A loving God gave a good gift called death as a consequence of human sin, because death is the only way that you'll ever stop sinning, and it prevents the person who will not repent from sinning more, and it is the only mechanism by which the believer can be reunited with God, because no living human being can be in the presence of a holy God.
Right. I'm looking at the next question here. This is from Nikki. Good evening. I was wondering, is it true that the core of the earth is molten and burning? He's answering something that we obviously talked about a lot earlier in the show. So not quite sure where we keep. If I read on, that you'll be able to pick it up anyway from this, I'm sure. Why doesn't the globe crack and fall apart? What keeps it together? And what is the distance through the middle?
Okay. The radius of the Earth is slightly less than 4,000 miles. So the distance across in diameter is close to, but under 8,000 miles. It is held together because of gravity. It is not on fire, but it's very hot. The Earth gets hotter as you go in at 30 degrees Celsius per kilometer, and I'm just trying to convert that. In English, it's 90 degrees Fahrenheit per mile on average as you start down. Therefore, the center of the Earth is at about 13,000 degrees Fahrenheit, though nobody has ever been there to measure it exactly. And that's about 6,700 degrees Celsius. Now, the Earth does not have a liquid center at the very center. We have the hard crust, then we have a liquid portion, but in the very center, it actually becomes solid a second time. The heat is way above the melting point, but it's solid because of the pressure. So I was trying to tick off all the answers to all the questions because there were several there. If I missed one, just remind me.
Okay. So it's not going to crack and fall apart.
No,
what holds it together? Gravity, you were saying. And what's the distance through it? You've already said. So let me go to the last point that Nikki mentions here. And that's, would you say that the human population has been atrophied in the last 6,000 years?
Oh, we are experiencing atrophy, not only of our living being, but also in our intelligence. The Human Genome Project was completed in 2003. So we have now known for 15 years, based on that, that we are losing 1% to 2% of our genetic information per generation. Now, initially, it was much, much less. When Adam sinned, Eve sinned, all systems started into a process of decay. That includes the genetics, the DNA. However, initially, the mistakes were quite small. But like a snowball going downhill, over 6,000 years, the mistakes don't get corrected and they add one to another. Today, each time we have a generation, we are passing on about another 60. We're adding about 60 new mistakes, new mutations per generation. Now, today, we're at the point of losing 1% to 2% per generation. What this would lead to is a genetic catastrophe. This is one of many scientific reasons that I can prove the Lord is coming back soon, even without the scripture. The decay of the Earth's magnetic field, the decay that we are experiencing in our genetic information.
Does that every 1,400 years something, is it?
The decay of the Earth's magnetic field is a half-life of 1,400 years. And
there you go.
Howard, don't tell me you don't remember some of the things that I've said to you.
Yeah, I'm getting old, mate. I'm atrophying.
You are, but we love you anyway.
Thank you. I'll be a living proof of a fossil that's only just 100 years old. And because of that deterioration going every 1,400 years to half it's where it is, it can't go another generation. Is that right? Or another 1,400 years? Because it won't exist, it will be too low.
Well, that's the problem. Humans could live on the Earth for a few hundred more years, no question about that. But the systems are going to continue to decay. Now, the Earth's magnetic field, has been decaying since creation and sin. Today, it's at only 5% of what it was 6,000 years ago. This does two things. First of all, intense magnetism at creation would have allowed for longevity that we cannot get today. In addition to which, the Earth's magnetic field is what holds the Van Allen radiation belts in place. And as the Earth's magnetic field has been decaying for 6,000 years, these bands of radiation that surround the Earth are getting closer and closer to the surface, and more radiation is leaking through, which is one of the primary reasons we see cancer rates going up.
Yes.
And the effect would be that if we were to go, say, 1,400 more years, and the field was down to 2.5%, it pretty much cooks all life on Earth.
Okay. My goodness. Howard, please ask Dr. Grady, if the Earth is young and presumably the universe is young, how do you explain that the light from many stars takes millions of light years to reach us? That's a good question, but I know you have the answer.
We do. The fact of the matter is, we talk about the law of gravity, the laws of thermodynamics, the laws of genetics, but the speed of light is not a law. That's the first thing you have to think about. Secondly, you have to remember that a light year is not a time. A light year is a distance, roughly 5.8 trillion miles. Now, with that in mind, experiments measuring the speed of light have been done for over 300 years, and we know that the speed of light is decaying. It is slowing down, as it should, because if the second law of thermodynamics affects all systems in the universe, why would light be exempt? Now, in my own book, I list 8 ways that you can have 3.82 billion light years of distance and be only 6,000 years old. I do cover a few of them in one of the DVDs on the age of the Earth and the age of the universe. However, you have to get over the hurdle. We've never measured the speed of light outside of our solar system. When you measure the speed of light on Earth, we know that over time it has been decaying in nature. One Russian scientist who does not have a creationist bent calculates, based on very good scientific evidence, that at one time in the past, the speed of light was 10 million times faster than today. Now, there are many ways in which you can get the distance that we see, and I'm not opposed to the distance. As far as I'm concerned, it can be 13.82 billion light years in distance. but it doesn't make it 13.8 billion years old. And so there are many ways in astronomy to prove that it is really quite young. And the decay of the speed of light is the biggest thing.
And bending the light?
Bending the light is what helps to cause redshift. Now, we can get redshift in the universe without expansion. There's a big argument, is the Earth, is the universe expanding, steady state? Is it coming in at the moment, the big crunch versus the Big Bang? Most evolutionists today are abandoning the Big Bang because they realize it doesn't work. They've gone back to simply saying, well, it's just eternal, which is the alternative to the Big Bang. However, you can get redshift without expansion. And there are many ways. You can get lazy light, meaning that as energy is used up, as light is traveling through the universe, it will shift red because the frequency slows down. Light hits a dust or a gas molecule in space. It heats it up. When the light is re-emitted, according to infrared heating, the object that is re-emitting the light will be from a warmer temperature, therefore a redder light. There's many different ways. We do know that gravity bends light. That's completely established at this point. Einstein theorized that we can prove it. And if you bend the light, it's going to shift red.
Sorry, Grady. Don't have my water in front of me. So bending of the light actually distorts the if you like, or inhibits the calculation of just how long that actually took in real time.
Bending light simply causes it to shift to the red.
Yeah.
It would not necessarily have any effect on age and time.
Right, okay.
But it would make it redder.
Okay.
And so when we talk about redshift, there's actually many different ways you can get redshift without the universe expanding, without a Big Bang.
Okay, we've got a couple of minutes left. Read this email. This is from Brian. He says, good evening. What would Grady's view be on what we hear a lot about these days on the internet with regards to the sun from the Solar Dynamics Observatory, who are said to be hiding the fact that the sun is presently losing its light due to the objects such as burnt-out stars that have lost their light, and various sizes having entered our solar system, which are feeding off the sun's outer mantle. Apparently, we do not see them easily, as they are not seen with the naked eye, but in the UV. This would appear to be in agreement with Scripture in that the last days the sun will become dark, says Brian. Just in a minute.
Okay, I'll try. The sun is losing mass, but it's actually getting brighter. In the past, it would have been cooler. So I know that seems contradictory, but that's the condition nonetheless. And much of the sun's heating is through gravitational contraction. Now, as far as the other objects in space, yes, we use gamma ray observatories, infrared observatories, ultraviolet observatories, not just visible light. And there are objects, of course, which are brighter and cooler and hotter. But the story about how they got that way, which is told by evolutionists, is not necessarily true. That's the big thing to remember. Don't believe the fairy tales for adults.
Okay. Dr. Grady, I just want to say thank you for being with us tonight. It's so unexpected as well, and such a delight for me, and also, I'm sure, for our viewers.
It's a delight for me because it's a totally unexpected pleasure.
Yeah, it's really good. I'm glad you had the ability to be able to broadcast from a hotel room there in, where was it again? Remind us?
Hernando, Mississippi.
Mississippi, right. Okay, we've got 30 seconds, and I would like to thank you all for writing in tonight. Sorry we didn't get through everything, and certainly, hopefully, some of you will have more questions as well. And we'll have Dr. Grady on again very shortly, because these are the tests that we're doing right now. Grady, good night, God bless you, and speak to you very soon. Stay on so I can have a quick word with you after the show. And to our viewers, you just got to say good night and God bless you, and thank you. Just keep reading the scriptures and listening to people like Dr. Grady. Good night and God bless. Bye. Ciao.